Good morning. My name's Roger Harrabin. I'm BBC Environment Analyst, which is an odd job title created a long while ago. I started reporting on the environment for the BBC 35 years ago, at which point the great Geoffrey Lean on The Observer was the only environment journalist in the UK. And I got a job with the BBC doing general stuff, and I would read Geoffrey Lean on a Sunday, and there was nobody following his stuff up. There was nothing on radio, nothing on television. It was really weird. So I just started doing stuff of my own accord. And before long, I'd become a de facto environment correspondent, working for radio. And then eventually I moved into television and online as well. So I have seen the debate in the UK progress over a very long period of time. And one interesting characteristic of recent years has been the emergence of a youth movement, a prominent youth movement on the environment, which I think probably never properly existed before. And now it's really making its voice heard. And we have three leading proponents of that movement with us today. So can I invite you onto the stage, ladies? First Scarlett, then Izzy, and then Mya-Rose, in that order. And I'm saying them in that order because this is age order. Welcome. Perfect. Take a seat. So, let me give you quick introductions. Scarlett Westbrook got the UK's earliest A-level in government and politics, age 13, which I think is pretty impressive. They're all pretty impressive, by the way. She's an activist, a writer, and she's also, I've just discovered, a figure skater and has smashed up her knee loads of times, so she's kind of limping round and has to limp off 5 minutes early to get a train. So we'll let her off the hook a bit early. She's just applying to university to do medicine. I'm trying to persuade her that if you do medicine, you have to tell your patients to eat breakfast. She has had no breakfast and has defiantly remained on a fast, even though I've been nagging her for the past 20 minutes. Next is Izzy Warren. She's been involved in Youth Strike for Climate and also the UK Student Climate Network. And the grandma of this panel is 19-year-old bird girl Mya-Rose Craig. She's a passionate birder, a conservation campaigner. She also campaigns particularly for equal access to nature for ethnic minorities. And again, I mean, this is a theme as well that is really under-examined, I think. So I'm delighted to be chairing this panel today. Can we start off, I think, let's start off with you, Scarlett, and just give us a bit of a feel as to how you got involved in this. I mean, you're still only 16 and, you know, clearly doing great things academically, but how did you get involved in this?
I'm 17 now.
You're 17?
Yeah,
Oh.
had a birthday.
Okay. Well, you're equal with Izzy then.
She's 6 months older, so
Oh,
still a pensioner compared
completely
to
the
me.
wrong order. You spoil my order.
No, she's still older, and then Maya. But yeah, I started getting involved in climate activism sort of stuff when I was about 9 or 10. When I was 9 or 10, it was 2014, late 2014. So the year just before the general election and also the Paris Convention. So I started seeing lots of stuff in the news about parties, manifestos, specifically on climate, and also the conversations about what we needed to see at the Paris Convention. And having had a really good science teacher in primary school, I already had an understanding of what the climate crisis was. So I got some manifestos from the local parties, pored over them, and I found two parties actually, which is quite odd, that I thought had a good climate policy. And I went to my parents and I was like, I need to go and canvass for these people so that they win and so that we have a good Paris Convention, age 10. So I started knocking on people's doors with my parents a few steps behind me, who both one affiliated with any party, had never really been in any parties or involved in politics. And after that, I just kept getting more and more engaged. So then when I was 12, I decided I wanted to do an A-level in government and politics, becoming the youngest person in the world to do so. And then I got that at 13, specialising in climate policy, started writing for The Independent a few months after I got that A-level, and then started organising climate strikes in Birmingham. From there, I got really involved in policy and political engagement, so now I'm one of the, if not the youngest contributors to policy in Westminster, being a contributor to the climate, the CEE bill, and also known as the Green New Deal bill, and also the English Climate Emergency Education Act. I think that's a good.
Right. I mean,
summary.
so a couple come up there. One is the involvement in ethnic minorities in the environment, and the other is I'm always slightly surprised why young people aren't more noisy. I mean, they have been a lot more noisy over the past 2 years, and a lot of leadership from Greta and people like yourselves. But I'm kind of surprised that given what is likely to happen in their future unless we mend things, I'm kind of surprised that they're not, jumping up and down on a more or less permanent basis. And also on the ethnic minority thing, have you got any thoughts about why, the environment movement is still predominantly white?
Is to me.
Yeah.
Sorry. I think in regards to why young people haven't been more active, when we learn about the climate crisis in school, the first thing we learn is about carbon footprints, which is something that BP, a petrol company, popularised, to shift the blame off from corporations and onto individuals. So by the time we really acknowledge the scale of the climate crisis, we already subconsciously believe that it's our fault. And if you feel guilty about something, you're probably not going to want to do much about it, which is probably a very clever move from BP because it protects their power. But that's obviously just not okay, and it's not something we should be teaching people. I think that addresses why people aren't as involved as they should be. In regards to why there isn't much involvement from people of colour in the climate movement, I think that's actually not the case. So when we think about climate activism, maybe now we look at Greta Thunberg, but before her there were leading people like Autumn Peltier, who was an Indigenous activist, who was one of the youngest people to speak at the UN. We have other people like Vanessa Nakate, who was also now a leading Ugandan activist. Whilst we kind of see the climate crisis as something that's a future event, people on the front line are already living the impact of the climate crisis, and those people tend to be the global majority, but ethnic minorities in the UK, I guess. And they're leading the fight against the climate crisis at home, even if that's probably not reflected in our own British media or British organising. With also on the media thing, I do think there's a lot of organisers of colour around, but I don't think they get equal airtime almost to their white peers.
What about the issue of voting? Because young people notoriously don't vote. And if you ask me what is the single best thing I can do to help prevent climate change running away, I would say vote. But young people are not voting. How can that be changed?
That's a great question. I think that young people are probably disillusioned because of the last few years or even decades, bringing with them the increase in university tuition fees and the introduction of them, and also lots of policies that continue to further marginalise.
But that wouldn't make them not want to vote. I mean,
Because,
it would make them want to vote even more.
The Liberal
Lib Dems,
Democrats
of course,
went
stitched them
back on their promises,
Yeah.
and I think that made people feel disillusioned with what people are promising even. I think that we really need to convince people that that was probably a one-off. Politicians do go back on their word, but that doesn't mean that has to be inevitable. By having enough public pressure for things, they can't really go back on their word. I think with the climate strikes in particular, they were obviously led by school children who can't vote. We don't have the power to influence the composition of the legislative. We've shown democracy, which means people power, by protesting. And I think by other young people who can vote, understanding that this isn't just ticking a box, it's actually influencing the future of the country, of the world, and of our own lives as well, in the same way protesting or something like that would be, which I think more people are generally supportive of, would be a positive step towards increasing youth engagement in voting.
Okay, thanks. We will come back to some of these things. Izzy, can you give us a bit about your background? What started your interest and what you've done since then?
Yeah, so I sort of came at it from the opposite angle to Scarlett. I came at it from a science perspective. I've always been really interested in science. I've really enjoyed it in school and various different types of science, but I then found conservation biology, and I'd seen a documentary about orangutans and elephants, and that really pushed me into wanting to do more for wildlife conservation. But I live in London. There's not a huge number of orangutans and elephants roaming around the streets of London waiting.
We've got squirrels.
Yes, that is true.
And foxes. And pigeons.
But I wanted to do something. I was sort of tired of campaigning online and doing social media campaigns and raising awareness, which is sort of when you're young, what you're told is the only thing you can do. You can raise awareness, you can talk to people, which is great to an extent, but then the awareness has been raised and that doesn't always correlate into action. And I wanted to do something that felt real and tangible, and I'd seen at that point the Australian climate strikes. I actually had no idea who Greta was. I hadn't seen any of that. But I'd seen news coverage of the Australian climate strikes when thousands of students walked out of school in protest over climate change. And I thought that was absolutely incredible. And I was like, why aren't we doing this here? We need to bring this to the UK. And luckily, a bunch of other people were thinking the same thing at the same time, and we all sort of connected at the right point, and we're able to start the UK Student Climate Network, and we're able to start the Youth Strike for Climate movement here in the UK. And it's all sort of snowballed from there, which was January 2019.
And how did that network coalesce?
It was mostly on social media. I think the power of social media in creating the youth climate movement cannot be underestimated. It is hugely important. It's the reason we've been able to do all of this. It's the reason we've been able to meet each other and mobilize across geographical boundaries, and also to connect with people who have very different experiences to us and who come from very different backgrounds to us, which is really important for a movement to be successful. So we'd all sort of found each other on social media. Someone had set up a Youth Strike for Climate UK Instagram account, and a bunch of the rest of us had been searching for that online, and we happened to come across the right account and send some DMs. And once we'd had the first strike in February of 2019, we gained a lot more visibility. People knew about the movement, and then we had people coming to us saying, hi, how can I get involved? I went to the strike, I want to do more. And it grew really rapidly from there.
I mean, the web is clearly a very powerful tool, but I think it's fair to say that the climate skeptics were onto it first. They were very powerful on the web, very influential, and putting all sorts of disinformation out over a very long period of time. I think environmentalists probably been a bit slower to catch up on new media. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that has been quite unique to the youth climate movement. I think the sort of adult-dominated climate movement that came before us was not utilising social media particularly well. And
well, I think it still isn't. I think
No.
the mainstream pressure groups still look really
No.
slow and shabby on social media.
And I think that's one of
Anybody here from Greenpeace? Or Friends of the Earth? No.
I think that's one of the reasons why it is so important to have a youth climate movement, because we're able to use these mediums and we're able to speak in a way and connect with other young people in a way that NGOs and adults haven't been able to. They haven't been able to mobilize young people. What's mobilized young people is other young people.
Yeah. Mya-Rose, tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, I might have to have a bit of a cough first. I'm quite unwell. Sorry, guys.
Sorry, cough.
Sorry, that was very unpleasant.
That's fine.
But yeah, I feel like my story getting involved in activism is quite twisty and weird, just in terms of the way that I entered it. Because I started, I guess, what I would call activism when I was about 11 years old, which was in 2012, 2013, which obviously was a long time before there were any wider youth movements. And I actually got into activism because I was really into bird watching. And, you know, it was my hobby. I loved it. I loved going out at the weekends, but I didn't have any close friends who had the same hobbies as me. Like, my friends got it, but none of them were that interested. None of them understood. So I decided, which was the done thing at the time, to start a blog called Bird Girl. And I never expected many people to read it, but loads of people did really quickly. And suddenly I was this 11-year-old girl with a very big platform. And I also realized really quickly that I wasn't that interested in just talking about nature when there were so many issues going on in the world that I felt like I should be talking about instead. And yeah, that was quite a long time ago, in the scheme of things. That was 8 years ago. And since then, I've gotten involved with various different causes, whether that was, you know, oil spills in Bangladesh or race equality in nature in the UK, or these days, something that's really important to me is pushing for intersectionality within the climate change movement, pushing for equity globally, which I feel like is absolutely a step that has to be made in order to make a movement, you know, make the movement sustainable, I suppose.
Tell me a bit more about the race equality from your perspective. so probably slightly different from Scarlett's by the sound of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, like I said, when approaching all of these issues, I come from very much like a nature background, and I'm also not white, I'm half Bangladeshi, and growing up, something I was incredibly aware of was just how white both environmental spaces were and the actual environmental spaces like the countryside, nature reserves. Um, and it was when I was around 13 years old that I realised there was this sort of deeper systemic issue going on, and I wanted to do something about it. And it wasn't as people had always told me, that there are just certain types of people who aren't interested in these issues, aren't capable of engaging with the outdoors. Um, so I started running a very grassroots project working with kids from inner city Bristol, where I'm from originally, and just running camps, taking them out into nature.
Hang on a second. How old were you at this point?
13.
Okay, fine.
And it was really scary because a lot of the kids were older than me as well. So lots of them were like 15, 16-year-old boys, and they were like very cool, and I like so wasn't. So there was that like whole layer of things as well. But it went really well, and these kids all had a really good time and connected with nature, and it showed me
So,
that there was something deeper
just let me
going
stop
on.
you there. What are your mum and dad doing at this point? What are they thinking?
I mean, on my mum's side at least, there's always been a real like almost culture of activism. My granddad was very involved with like um, Bangladeshi independence and Bristol bus boycotts and things like that. Two of my aunts um, are race workers in Bristol, and my mum was just really proud of me because, you know, I was going out and doing something about issues that I cared about, and my parents have always been really supportive
So
of
they
that.
supported you taking these older kids away for the weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Which sounds crazy when you put it like that, but it all made sense within the context of it. And I guess what I'm trying to say is doing the more grassroots side of things helped me realise that there were much more systemic issues going on. And eventually I set up my charity Back to Nature when I was 14. That was all about fighting against discrimination and fighting against racism in environmental spaces.
And do you think those camps and your early activism, do you think that's made a lasting impression on the people who turned up? Or did they just think, oh, that's great, it's for the weekend, we'll go back to doing what we normally do?
I know it's had a lasting impression on these kids for various reasons. Like, we're never trying to create mini environmentalists, because that's not really our job. We're trying to forge that connection with nature because it's so important both for the health of our planet but for our own mental health. So my favourite stories are just talking to kids and them talking about how they now watch birds when they're walking to the school bus and things like that. But we have had a few kids come out and say, actually, I wanna get involved in nature in some shape or form with my job. Or some kids just, I suppose, having the scope of their life widened slightly like that, have decided that they want to go and be like lawyers or something like that, rather than just doing whatever they decided they wanted to do before. And I think that's why it's so important for the kids that we work with, because it's widening their life. And now I'm going to cough again.
Okay, feel free. Given where we are geographically, I have in mind sort of what's the nearest wildlife. And the nearest wildlife, I think, is the pigeons in Trafalgar Square. Now, there has been a long debate about whether we should feed them contraceptives or shoot them, or, you know, what should we do? What should, as a birder, what do you think to pigeons?
This might not be a popular opinion. I really like pigeons. And I think if they weren't really, really common, people would think that they're really beautiful as well. This might be a very hot take, but I think that they're great. And I think also, like, looking at the history of pigeons, we domesticated them. We brought them into our cities. And it's not really their fault that they just do so well, that they thrive. So yeah, I'm personally a big fan of pigeons, but I'm also not a city planner.
No, I'm afraid I've really got it in for pigeons. My relatives came to town a long while ago, and insisted on going to Trafalgar Square. And I said, can't bear going to Trafalgar Square. There's all these pigeons. They crap all over the place. They said, oh, we still want to come to Trafalgar Square. So we turned up in Trafalgar Square, and do you know what? I just had a tiny bald patch. Then just a tiny bald patch, and they bloody hit right on my bald patch, which my relatives thought was hilarious. But anyway, that's not the sort of wildlife we want to encourage, is it? And let me pick up on the serious theme here, which you just mentioned, which is equity. Let me get thoughts from you guys about equity, about the way things are going in terms of equity. Because it seems to me, there are a lot of noisy developing nations, and rightly noisy, but governments yet, and particularly in this country, haven't yet really understood the implications of equity in the UK. So if you go back to the Citizens' Assembly about this time, earlier last year, the clear mandate from the clear message from the Citizens' Assembly was that yes, we support climate policies, yes, we don't mind changing our lives somewhat, but it's got to be fair, and you can't be just allowed to say offset your emissions if you're rich and then have 10 foreign holidays a year. If I'm only having 1 foreign holiday a year, it's got to be equal. I just wonder how you guys think the idea of equity is or isn't filtering its way into the mainstream debate.
We know that the climate crisis is going to impact people disproportionately, and that its effects aren't going to be equal. And it's the people who've bought our way into the climate crisis who will be able to buy themselves out to safety, whilst those who have contributed the least to the climate crisis will impact its fronts disproportionately. And whether that's the countries in the so-called global south who have their economies incapacitated by colonialism and the scars of that left, even though they're now going to disproportionately experience impacts of the climate crisis for which they can't afford the climate resilience technology they need, or if that's black and brown people in the UK experiencing inhumane levels of air pollution because of being more likely to live in inner city areas where air pollution is higher. There's definitely an injustice
But it doesn't seem to me to have really filtered into the mainstream there.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, particularly you said about, polluted streets. It is typically the poorer people who live on those streets. And getting the noise pollution as well as the air pollution as well. Can't sleep at night and can't have their windows open. But that doesn't ever seem to kind of break through. I mean, I've tried over the years from time to time to sort of make these points, but I mean, my editors don't seem very interested in it. I don't know. I hope there's none out there. Don't tell anybody. It doesn't. I can't break through with it. What do we do about that?
I think it's because of the focus that we've had on individualism for so long. When we talk about climate, whether that's in citizen assemblies or in the media, it's talking about how we can reduce our own carbon footprint. We should switch the lights off or recycle more, and then we're going to get our way out of this climate crisis when 100 companies are responsible for 71% of carbon emissions globally, bearing in mind the entire continent of Africa is only responsible for 2 to 3% of carbon emissions. And I think we really need to fight back against this notion of corporate-driven and corporations like BP-driven individualism around the climate crisis, and really frame it as something that's bigger than us, because it is. It's beyond having shorter showers. It's about expropriating the power of fossil fuel corporations, and it's about, I think, also understanding that as a society there is widespread inequality. I think that because we're a so-called developed nation, people think that we don't have real poverty here, when we know that over 4 million children are living in absolute poverty in 2021 in the 5th largest economy. And I think that won't be conveyed across to the public unless we kind of show them more what this actually looks like. We've had some good documentaries on what poverty looks like in the UK, for example, but they're too far and few, and that's not good enough. And I also think we really need to change the narrative around the climate crisis and what we do. I've been doing TV interviews for years now, and one question I'll always get is, okay, that's good, you're writing laws, but what have you personally done to tackle the climate crisis? And, I've been vegetarian for a few years now, but the last time I checked, there's still extreme flooding and droughts. I think this comes as a shock to the producers, but that needs to change. And I think there needs to be a widespread discussion.
I mean, there's a couple of things here. One is that we as journalists are kind of trained to ask the difficult question. And the difficult question is, what have you done? And also to personalise things. But the other thing is that our audience research shows that people, when they're learning about climate change or reading about climate change or watching about it, they want to know what they can do personally so they feel they have a sense of agency. So, for instance, if you're making a film for, say, ITN, then you're going to get your best pictures will be of people doing things. Television likes to see movement, so your pictures will be of, whatever it might be, making your vegetarian food or cycling or something like that. And then at the end, the reporter might stand up and do a piece to camera and say, well, of course, actually, this is trivial compared to what major corporations ought to do, but we're telling you anyway. And yet, when you switch off the news that night, you're just left with the images of what you should be doing, as demonstrated by other people. So we have real problems with our storytelling about this, especially as audiences appear to want to be told themselves what they can do to give them a sense of agency. I mean, Izzy, let me bring you in here. Have you got any thoughts on all that?
I think the media, and especially like the right wing in politics and the media, have been very clever in the way that they've painted climate action over the last few years, last few decades, because they've framed it as a sacrifice that we have to make. We are going to lose quality of life. Everything's going to get worse if we want to deal with the climate crisis, which is an interesting way of looking at it, because I'm sure there are ways of tackling the climate crisis that do involve that, but not the ways that we're fighting for. And we're fighting for a just transition. We're fighting for policies like a Green New Deal that aren't going to push more people into poverty. They aren't going to mean that you can't go to work because the oil rig that you work on is being closed down. We're fighting for policies that create new jobs, that create well-paid, safe, secure, unionized jobs. And a lot of the solutions to the climate crisis are going to improve the quality of life of people. They are going to improve people's lives in the UK. It's a fight for social justice as much as a fight for environmental justice. And the way that we've managed to sort of switch the conversation from look at all of these things that will help the planet and also improve our society so much to, if we want to address climate change like these protesters on the street are telling us to, this is all the stuff that you're going to miss out on, this is all the stuff that you're going to lose. And I think there is a difference between giving people agency over the climate crisis and giving people things that they can do, and also making it feel like that is all that they can do and that they have to be doing that. Because I'm personally not fighting to get everyone to stop using plastic straws or to go vegan. That's not what this is about for me. I'm fighting to make sure that those changes and those choices are accessible to everyone. Because as long as we've got food poverty, as long as we've got food deserts and people don't have access to fruit and vegetables or healthy food, like, going vegan's not a priority here. The priority is making sure that children and people in the UK are being fed. And once we've addressed that, which we can do through some of the same policies that will address the climate crisis, then we can say, okay, let's readdress our dependence on animal agriculture. Then we can say, let's think about how we use plastics and disposable plastics. But until we've made those changes accessible to people and to the vast majority of people, and it's not sort of the reserve of the privileged, those changes are useless, because a handful of people doing that is going to do nothing. That's not going to stop the climate crisis. And those changes are important, but putting guilt and pressure on people to make changes that they aren't able to make, or to make sacrifices that they genuinely aren't able to make, that's not justice. That's not environmental justice. That's not social justice. And that's not what we're fighting for here.
But we don't seem to be seeing these initiatives coming through.
No. And I think that's a problem with both the youth environmental movement. I think it's a problem with the NGO environmental movement. I think it's a problem with the media and with politicians. You've still got politicians, Boris Johnson doing his speeches about how actually what you need to do is not rinse your dishes before you put them in the dishwasher.
That was his spokeswoman, not Boris himself, to be fair. But I don't want to be fair to Boris Johnson, but I do have to be in this case. It was Allegra Stratton who said
I think, but getting those messages from the government
it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it puts people in a weird position, because on the one hand, that sounds absurd. You know that not rinsing your dishes before you put them in the dishwasher is not going to solve the greatest crisis the planet has ever faced. And then it sounds so ridiculous that you're like, okay, I'm not going to do anything, because all of that sounds stupid. And I think we need to be, as a movement, and I definitely feel that we haven't done this enough as much as we've tried, we need to be pushing this narrative more, that we need systemic change to the climate crisis, we need policy change, that individual action is not the way that we're going to get ourselves out of this. And I think NGOs need to be doing it as well, because in the same thing that you were saying about the media, NGOs want to push for things that will get traction, that will get them clicks on social media, that will get them sort of more widespread support. And if that is something simple like compost your apple cores, then they're going to do that. And we need to be thinking more about what is the actual message that we want out there, not what's the easiest message to get out there.
I think the thing with climate change, though, it is already such a systemic problem that it cannot be attacked by just a few simple policies. I mean, maybe a carbon tax might help, although it's controversial, would never be agreed ultimately by all companies that appear to be proposing it now. But we all can do something. So, for instance, we could stop flying, or stop flying so much. We could buy an electric car if we could afford it. We could walk or cycle more. We could go vegan or vegetarian, and certainly cut down on meat. Everybody collectively could do a bit, and that might make them feel like that they were doing their bit, so long as other parts of society were also doing their bit. But in terms of companies, you see the oil and gas majors like Shell and BP. I mean, what are they supposed to do? They live and die on oil and gas. Mya-Rose.
I mean, I think there's two things when talking about these issues. First, I think whenever we're talking about individual climate action, we have to acknowledge that, that stat that gets brought up all the time, that 100 corporations are responsible for over 70% of global carbon emissions. That's ridiculous. But I think also when talking about political change, you mentioned that a few laws and bills won't do very much. I think taking broad action, but also making very bold statements, for example, removing lobbying power from fossil fuel companies would make a massive difference, especially within the UK and the USA.
And the EU.
And the EU. And so I think it's...
I'm going to say, let me just stop you there. Under what power are you going to remove lobbying?
It's not removing lobbying power, it's removing... Okay, it's two things. Firstly, we have if we're talking about the UK in particular, we have MPs voting or changing bills that are being passed through who are being funded in some shape or form by fossil fuel companies in some shape or form. And they do, in theory, have to announce that relationship, but they don't have to, and quite often it isn't happening at the moment. And so it's not, I'm not calling to get rid of our democracy in the UK.
It's not nearly as bad as in the USA, where
no, in the USA it's absolutely shocking, and it is one of the main reasons that the USA is per capita the worst country in the world in terms of carbon emissions.
But what can you do about that? They have an amendment guaranteeing freedom of speech, and that whenever it's challenged, they bring up the amendment on freedom of speech, the amendment to the Constitution. And challenge never gets anywhere because it's a fundamental human right in the USA to say what you want to whoever you want.
But I'd say that there's a difference between, we're getting quite into it now, without it's not challenging freedom of speech to be removing funding, removing, again, lobbying power by these massive companies. It's not freedom of speech. They're influencing politicians.
They claim it is.
That doesn't mean it is. And I think this isn't a wider issue within... This is what I mean by we're getting into it, but I think this is a wider issue in politics where quite often in America in particular, freedom of speech is used as an excuse for what is essentially corruption. And so... I'm
not disagreeing with you.
Yeah,
I'm just saying...
to lay it out clearly.
I've tried to draw attention to it for decades, but it seems to be stuck, and I can't see a way to...
But again, this is just one suggestion of many, many things that are, at the end of the day, not... major laws that are affecting the majority of the people in the country, but small things that can be done that would have a massive influence on climate change and on climate change politics. And there's loads of things like that, and depending on different countries as well, there's loads of things that can be done. But to go back to your original question, because I thought it was really interesting, talking about equity in the climate change movement, I think one thing that I've really, really noticed, especially in the past few years with this real explosion of a youth movement, is that it feels very much like it's a generational thing as well, where young people are coming at it again with this word again, a much more intersectional approach to things. They are coming into a movement, seeing how everything links together, how we need to deal with social issues to deal with environmental issues, Well, I think older generations just aren't really seeing that anymore because that's not the way that they're used to looking at things. So in particular, something I hear from older people all the time is, they've been banging on about climate change for decades and nothing seems to have happened. And they keep on saying we're on the tipping point, but I haven't seen any change. And it's like, that's because you're middle class and you're well off and you don't live in a poor area of the country or of the city. Because if you did, you would be experiencing neighborhoods getting washed away in the southwest or children dying from the bad quality of air in inner city London. And I think it's absolutely important, like as we have been doing, to highlight these intersections because people just don't seem to see climate change otherwise. They just don't seem to see it. And so when you have people talking about climate change being the great equalizer of this planet, nothing makes me laugh more when we literally have billionaires looking into space travel trying to get away from Earth as fast as they can. And so I think we need older generations in particular to completely, I suppose, skew that very traditionalist perspective of looking at environmental issues, which I think, to be honest, stemmed from what was really a very privileged, almost tree hugger hippie movement of the 60s, which had very, decades-long repercussions for the wider environmental movement.
Scarlett, I think you want to come in on this.
Just going back to earlier when we were talking about freedom of speech, I don't think the problem is freedom of speech. The problem is that there's limitations on who freedom of speech is granted to. These oil companies and other lobbyists have the power of money and have the power of gifts of holidays and big financial aid packages, and that's what's making their voices heard above climate protesters. We can actually intervene in this. When we had the banking crisis, the financial recession, we stepped in, we bailed out the banks. Why can't we bail out the climate? Our government is considering expanding the North Sea oil exploration because of the ties it has to oil companies. That's not ethical, and I guess it wouldn't tie into what our constitutional values are of integrity and protecting our citizens and that sort of stuff. So it's the fact that our constitutional values are conditional on the amount of money or power that we possess. That's what the problem is here. To have, climate action, what we need, I think, is a Green New Deal, which is a 10-year government-led mobilisation to rapidly decarbonise the economy whilst also bridging inequality in society and the wider world. It means pushing investment into the areas that need it most, for example, inner city areas where air pollution is bad, having a just transition for these places too. There's millions of workers in carbon-intensive sectors. We can't just lay them off. We need to make sure that they have the retraining and skills necessary to be able to go into green jobs which are guaranteed for them and are well paid, secured and unionised so they're protected. There's a multitude of things we can do. There's lots of policy floating about, and I think the government is choosing actively not to implement it. We've seen them turn down so many countless climate proposals and sneer at EDMs, which obviously aren't policy, but they're suggestions of things that we can do sometimes. And I think that this is an active choice, and I don't think that, again, freedom of speech, I don't think it's a limitation. It's the fact that who has freedom of speech is conditional on the government. That's not something that should happen. I work in the charity sector and I had to take an anti-bribery course, a 10-minute one, saying I couldn't accept money from anyone I work with. I don't really work with anyone outside of my organisation, but why don't the government have to do that? If they took that 10-minute work right course that I actually sped through in 2 minutes, I don't think they'd be going on holidays funded by Shell. I don't think they'd be taking thousands of money from corporations. If I did that, I'd be sacked.
I have to say, I haven't heard of anybody taking holidays funded by Shell. And
if you go on the Guardian's website, they have a climate score for every single MP, and there's quite a few who have holidays funded by oil companies.
Really? I'll
from
have
all
a look.
sides of the house. It's not just the party in power.
I mean, I think I must defend the party in power to an extent because they because they have set world-leading limits for greenhouse gases, 78% cut by 2035. I know it doesn't include embodied emissions in terms of our imports, but it has, in my opinion, it has set an international benchmark to which other countries are being invited to aspire, and that is a good thing. Now, in terms of what they're actually doing, well, that's very different. They're doing less than a quarter of what they need to be doing in order to achieve the target. But the target itself is there. They're also trying to level up, and they are already putting some substantial investment, particularly into the northeast of the country, those moribund cities which are really seriously economically damaged and which have already experienced bad unemployment. But you know, I would say that the Green New Deal movement, I think the objectives are absolutely right, but if you look at the potential of the government to create the same number of jobs in any given place as the jobs that will be lost, I think that is really probably not very realistic. And I think there will be some shocks along the way. There will be jobs created, but not necessarily in the places where people are. And I fear there's probably too much optimism about that. Anyway, can you just kind of bear in mind, because I would like to come to the audience pretty soon actually, so I'm just going to get to comment on what I've just said, and then if I see hands I can send a microphone in your direction. So think of exercising your right arm, or even your left arm is also acceptable. What do you think about that, Izzy, what we were just talking about?
I think it's great for the government to make pledges. I can also make pledges. I can tell my parents I'm going to get 3 A stars in my A levels, but if
I'm sure you will.
If I just stop working now, that's not going to happen. Anyone can make promises and pledges and say we're going to do this in 3 decades, we're going to do this by 2035. But if you're not actually doing it, that doesn't stop the climate crisis. Climate change doesn't go, oh wow, I saw the UK government set a really great promise and I'm just going to stop now. That's not how we get out of the climate crisis. And so for the UK government to claim that they are world leaders because they're setting promises, okay, well, anyone can be a world leader in setting promises. We don't need world leaders in setting promises. We need world leaders in taking action. And the UK has a requirement to be a world leader because the UK has a historical responsibility for a huge amount of the climate crisis. We don't get bonus points here for taking action on climate. When we were the first country to have an industrial revolution, we were the first country to start emitting greenhouse gases, we colonized half the world and created the systems that have meant so many people around the world are vulnerable to climate change now. We have a responsibility to be world leaders, and that means actually being world leaders. It doesn't mean making these pledges that everyone knows we're not going to keep, saying we're going to cut greenhouse gas emissions while also approving a new oil field. Like, there needs to be some degree of symmetry between what the government is saying and what they're doing, and right now that's not there.
They have set a lead by banning internal combustion engine cars, or most of them, for sale by 2030. I mean, that's a really extraordinary story, which would have been very hard to predict. I'm going to say, I did promise hands. I'll let you have a go here unless I can see a hand.
That policy would be great, but
Yeah, sorry, let me send. Can you send a microphone, please, to the person in green? And you can't touch the microphone. I'm sorry, because of COVID, you have to talk into it. Sorry, you were drowned by applause then. I don't know if it's happened often in your life, but you will have to say it again.
So I just wanted to say, ladies, you're very, very impressive, and it's a real joy to listen to you speak today. It's really wonderful. I have a question about COVID, because I feel, I mean, from my personal experience, that it's kind of distracted people off the climate change movement. Did you feel that as well? Have you felt that the last 18 months, obviously the media, but also the attention has been taken away from climate change and onto COVID? What's your views on this?
Scarlett.
I want to go into medicine. A lot specifically about the links between climate change and medicine. I want to be a humanitarian trauma surgeon, but that's, another story. We know that there's a really big link between climate change and global warming and disease spreading. So diseases like COVID, because when global temperatures increase, animals change their migration patterns, so they come into contact with more species, which means disease spreads faster. And COVID is an example of what the future will look like if we don't have climate action. And I actually think a lot of politicians, organisations and people have realised that the fact that zoonotic diseases diseases spread from animals to humans will severely increase. So I think that it maybe has taken attention away from the climate crisis in the media, but it started wider conversations about what we need in terms of public health and global health and the action that we need to take. We had global climate strikes yesterday, and I don't think we saw a dip in numbers compared to usual. We saw thousands across the country. It's not our biggest strike, but also, we didn't have the same funding we had when we had 450,000 people strike. I think, if anything, it's opened up wider conversations that we weren't seeing before. As someone really passionate about global health, before COVID, I wasn't really seeing anyone outside of academics discuss the implications of pandemics and global warming, and now that's something that I think anyone who wants to know about it can access, because it's been broken down so much and is being so widespread.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try and get around as many questions as I can. There's a guy here in the grey top with a black mask on. Could we get a microphone to him in the middle there?
Thank you. Really, really inspiring to hear from all of you. I just wonder if you could reflect on teachers and education, and several of you have mentioned the importance of those, and whether you feel failed by the education system at all, and what you would say the future of the education system should be to try and promote these ideas.
Thank you. That's a nice question. Izzy?
I think the education system has definitely failed to teach young people about the reality of the climate crisis. I did geography GCSE, and in it I vividly remember having to make notes on a page of my textbook that had the positives of climate change alongside the negatives. It's going to be really great for the UK's thriving orange growing industry. And I think the fact that we're being taught that at all, that we're being told that there are positives to the climate crisis, is ridiculous, and the fact that's in our textbooks. But I will hand over to Scarlett on this, because she is the expert here on climate education.
I'm not supporting that, but there are some positives to climate change, particularly in fewer winter deaths. Should we not? You're saying the media shouldn't mention that, even if they put it in context and say that we expect that those numbers will be dwarfed by deaths from climate change. Should we actually not mention it? Should that be censored?
I think first, that wasn't one of the examples that was ever given in schools. I think it's more to do with the fact that the emphasis on we must present a balanced view of the climate crisis and we must talk about the positives and the negatives, it contorts it into an issue that it isn't, because the climate crisis is a problem, and treating it in schools like it isn't a problem, and the way that it's talked about in schools right now and the way that it's written about in textbooks doesn't really show it as a crisis. It doesn't really show it as a problem. It talks about it as this sort of vague, distant scientific concept, and it doesn't relate it back to people. It doesn't relate it to the actual lived impacts and experiences of people. And I think that's the problem. Being told you have to write a balanced essay in which you talk about the positives and negatives of climate change equally in school, that's really problematic. And if they were
is that actually happening?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Sorry, just to add, because I think it's really interesting, because I went to school a couple years above you, so it's just before the syllabus change. And when I was 14, I wasn't even taught that climate change was what was going on. I was taught that it was one of several hypothetical things that was going on, another one being that it was a natural heating of the planet, another one being something else that I can't remember. I wasn't even taught that climate change was happening until I was about 16 years old, so I absolutely do feel let down by the education system, and I think the fact that that happened in maybe 2015 or 2016 is absolutely ridiculous.
Okay, got a lot more questions, so just right here, the fourth row back.
Going to be as good as speaking as you guys, because you're absolutely amazing, but I was listening to you, and I was actually getting quite cross. I'm sorry, Roger, but I don't know how you guys feel if the media actually still emphasizing the same old stories that they've always told. I mean, even in your questions, you're bringing it back to the points that the ladies here are trying to argue against, I feel, and I think if it's a matter of perspective, if the government and the older generation in their own perspectives can't see the rigidity of their ideas, the traditional ideas, and if they're not allowing the youth to speak up and actually tell their stories without editing them for the older audience. Yeah, I don't know
So,
if that actually
tell me
came
a bit
across.
more. Do you think I shouldn't challenge their views?
I think you should challenge the views for sure, but I think it needs to be addressed as to how they are challenged and how they're edited. So when you're cut off or when you channel the questions into, or like defending the government, saying about the pledges when, yes, we're levelling up the country maybe, but by building high speed 2, which...
Look, I agree with you. I'm on record as saying HS2 is a complete waste of time. I've taken more interest in that than I think any other member of the media. But I'm just wondering which things you think I shouldn't mention.
I think it's more allowing the stories to tell themselves and for the ladies to tell their story without thinking how the audience are going to respond to that. And I think the media a lot of the time, not just you, but the media in whole, as we all know, they focus on certain parts of the stories because at the end of the day, the whole commercial system is just in the pocket of the oil industries, I do feel. And I'm really not putting my point across that well.
Let me put that to the guys.
Yeah, you're going to get it.
Any thoughts?
I think I'm coming from a different perspective here because I'm a journalist too. I do a lot of writing for The Independent especially. And I think a lot of the times I've been the first to report on issues. I was the first journalist to criticise Biden's climate policy when he became president. I was one of the first journalists to criticise Boris Johnson at G7 and that sort of stuff. And I think that's interesting because, I'm obviously not a trained journalist. I'm still doing my A-levels. I do think that the media has, I think there's a spread of how media is covered. And there's definitely some good journalists like yourself. I've watched your coverage before. And there's some not so good journalists, for more right-wing media. And I don't know, I think that we maybe need to be more comprehensive in how we approach climate. And I also think this is beyond individual journalists too, because, there's producing teams and so much more. It's a hard narrative to shift, I think, in journalism. Yeah, as a writer, I'm not a broadcaster. It's easier for me to go to my editor and be like, I want to write about this, and it can just happen, and we know that there's going to be an audience because people follow my work. But with the news, because it's broadcasted to millions of people, there has to be, all of these other considerations about how the public will react to them and how we give a balanced view. For example, we can't just slate a party without asking them for comment, even in writing too. I've tried. Didn't work. I think the conversation should be
we
more...
have to be fair. It's part of
we have to
be fair.
Do this.
Or
But
try
I
to be
think
fair.
what we need to do as an industry is almost reframe how we think the public will react. I think sometimes as a general industry, I think we talk down to people a lot. I think we maybe need to change that. And I also think we need to get better at storytelling too. I think when we talk about numbers, Izzy said this, it was really good. Izzy said we talk about numbers and about 2 degrees, but 2 degrees doesn't change the clothes you're wearing, let alone bringing the planet to existential collapse. And we need to get better at communicating statistics, making data more accessible to people, or the general public who don't have all of the research and qualifications journalists might do. We need to be better at storytelling, at looking at individual communities and showing how that projects on a wider scale. We need to be balanced and impartial because that's the law, in broadcasting, but make sure that we're not understating effects. I know we were speaking about climate education earlier. I work in climate education. I've contributed to bills about climate education. And in the current climate education that we have, it doesn't give the context. It gives the benefits and the negatives, but it doesn't say that the negatives outweigh the benefits. I think it's about context. It's about trying to connect more with people. Understanding that people are intelligent, even little kids are intelligent. I've had some really insightful comments from a year 3 class 2 weeks ago that I hadn't thought about before. That's completely reshaped my view. And I think that as the media as an industry needs to reframe how we're approaching topics to ensure that they're conveyed well to audiences. I think we need to have more climate journalists at a wider range of publications and outlets. And I think that as a society too, we need to reframe how we're addressing problems. And a lot of that comes from how we're taught about the climate in schools, how we're spoken to about it in the media, and what the government is doing about it. So it's a multi-level thing, and it's really difficult, but we can do it if we want to.
Thank you for your thoughts. Do you have to hobble off now?
Yes.
All right. Can we give Scarlett a round of applause? Limping off to another engagement. While she does so, Izzy, BBC Tell the Truth is a slogan from Extinction Rebellion. We were picketed, well, we have been picketed several times. Once I went off for lunch and came back and a picket had emerged, and I was very tempted to ask to speak to the crowd on the mic with the microphone, saying, look, I've been doing this for 35 years and I really have tried to tell the truth, and it's rather difficult. But my editor said, no, for God's sake, don't do that. Otherwise, anybody who turns up to picket us will need to be addressed by a member of BBC management. So I never got to say anything. But tell me, what do you think to that slogan and to the job that the media does generally?
So I'm not a member of Extinction Rebellion, so I can't comment on their motivations for doing that.
No, but do you agree with the message that the BBC is not telling the truth?
I think no media really is telling the truth. I think the lack of coverage of the climate crisis, the lack of making connections between the climate crisis and other issues in society, the way that the environment is treated as a standalone media thing, and we have our environment stories and then we have the news. Like, that is
very frustrating for those of us who work in it as well, I can assure you.
I can imagine, and that's really frustrating because it makes the work of environmental activists really difficult when we're trying to say, actually, the problems with foreign policy and the problems with transport and domestic policy and all of these other things that are being talked about on the news, that is all environmental as well. Like, the environment plays into all of this, the climate crisis plays into all of this, and the way that the media separates these two issues is really makes it really difficult to then get the public to understand what we're trying to talk about, to get the public to understand how all of these things are interlinked and how all of these solutions and crises are interlinked as well. I think the media definitely needs to do more. It's been a surreal experience the past few weeks in the lead up to COP. Suddenly pitching environmental stories is so easy.
Yeah.
I don't need to have like 16 press releases and go through like 30 journalists to try and get one story out. It's like everyone wants to talk about climate, and this is how it needs to be always, not just in the lead up to COP. And I really hope that this stays after COP, that there is more of an interest in the environment, and there is more of an interest in not just stories specifically like the climate story, but an environmental angle on other things. Like, that's been really exciting to see, in that shift in sort of the last few months has been really exciting to see. And I think it's indicative of what the role that the media can play if they let themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult to achieve, and over the many decades I've seen the environment come up and down, up and down, up and down, and typically what happens after a sort of great orgy of coverage like we're having now over the COP, typically news editors will say, bored, done that, heard all those messages, not interested. And so I'm anticipating, I'm not predicting, but I am anticipating a drop in coverage, a very substantial drop in coverage after the COP, because we will just kind of feel like we've done it. Anyway, Mya-Rose, your thoughts on the media, and we'll have to close with this.
I have many thoughts on the media. I mean, I think it's a few things. I think, firstly, there's always, and this is from the left and the right actually, there's always this feeling when being interviewed as an environmental activist that they're always trying to catch you out in some way. And there's been this moment many times over the years where it's sort of this got you moment. You participate in society, so you're not allowed to critique it. And that's not how it works. You know, it's like these two were talking about earlier, just because I'm trying to think of an example. I don't eat meat, but like just because I eat cheese or whatever doesn't mean that I'm not allowed to talk about you know, the carbon footprint of animals, etc., etc. And I think especially as a young activist, and especially actually pre the real spike in popularity of youth strikes, it very often felt while being interviewed like I was being condescended to, or I didn't really know what I was talking about, or as I had someone say to me directly once, little girls should sit down and stop talking about politics. You know, so there's always that feeling for me.
Was that a cabinet minister?
No, thankfully. Although I have talked to a few who have been quite condescending in their time. But I think, so there's always that side of things as well. But I think, which I was going to mention earlier, and I think this is a wider issue, it's not just a media issue. I think environmentalism, and not environmentalism, I think the environment has been way too overly politicised, to the point where, which I suppose lines up with this rider thing of the rise of the right and the far right within Europe and America. But I think it's become this thing where it's sort of, the left cares about the planet and the environment, and the right doesn't care about the environment and the planet, and that's the way it has to stay.
Well, but that was a deliberate ploy from the right wing,
absolutely.
funded by the
deliberate,
fossil fuel industry in the USA.
It worked, and it's happening, and now we've ended up, because we have many right-wing governments across Europe and in America, and we've ended up in this political situation where government leaders feel like they're almost betraying the right by taking decisive environmental action. So I think in some ways Boris Johnson's actually a very interesting figure as a Prime Minister, because he is, in my opinion, very right-wing. But he also seems to kind of care about the environment sometimes, not that he's taken any action on it particularly. But I think
he has. I mean, the cars thing. Let's not.
Yeah,
let's
okay,
not
the cars thing,
that's major.
and I suppose the Boris bikes a very long time ago now. But I think figures like that show where this ideology doesn't quite match up, and it shows how, I suppose, fake it all is. Because I think the difference between if we go to the UK, the difference between modern Conservatives and traditional Conservative Party is that traditional Conservative Party would be approaching climate change in a traditional way, that is, looking at the economic side of things, while in our modern day politics, like I said, it's become right-wing, shouldn't care about the environment, and so the whole party and that whole part of the country has become extremely resistant to positive environmental change. And I think if I'm gonna conclude on anything today, I think this is one of the main political barriers that we need to overcome. It is that politicisation of environmental issues, which, like you said, I know has been very purposeful. It's a ploy, but that's, you know, even more motivation to break through those barriers.
How to unpick it, that is the question, but not one we have time for now. Mya-Rose has her book on sale downstairs at the book shop, and she will sign it for you if you want to buy one. But now it's left to me to just say, I was going to say these young women are formidable, but then I've heard the phrase patronising, so I'm thinking, is that patronising? You know, just because they're young women, does that mean they have to be formidable? No. So I'm not going to say you were formidable, although you were. I'm going to say it's been really terrific panel. And I got parachuted in at the last minute, and I've just loved it. So can we give them a hearty round of applause?